Antisemitism, a specialized form of hatred directed at Jews, is often called the world's oldest form of hatred. In 2016, British rabbi, philosopher, and author Jonathan Sacks gave a lecture that tried to answer a difficult question. What is anti-Semitism? His answer was both unsettling and thought-provoking. I struggle with this, Sacks told his audience, because if you try to understand anti-Semitism as a coherent set of beliefs, you quickly discover it's not coherent at all. It's a set of contradictions. Jews in the 19th century were hated because they were poor and because they were rich, because they were communists and because they were capitalists, because they kept to themselves and because they infiltrated everywhere. Going further, Voltaire hated the Jews for their ancient superstitious faith, but Stalin hated them for being rootless cosmopolitans who believed nothing. Anti-Semitism is a set of contradictions, and the only way I've found to understand it is to think of it as a virus. Just as a virus carries disease into the human body, anti-Semitism infects the body politic. The human body has an immune system, an extraordinary defense that detects viruses and repels them. So how do viruses survive? They mutate. They change until the immune system no longer recognizes them. After the Holocaust, the West built the strongest immune system against anti-Semitism the world had ever seen, through anti-racist laws, interfaith dialogue, and Holocaust education. For half a century, it seemed to work. But then what happened? Anti-Semitism mutated, and in doing so, it defeated that immune system. Anti-Semitism is once again on the rise throughout the world. The Times of Israel claims that globally it has surged 340% in the past 2 years. In July of 2025, Elon Musk and his AI creation Grok provided a real-life example of the rabbi's metaphor of hate mutating into a virus. Musk has left a trail of breadcrumbs suggesting that he's a believer in many, if not most, extremist far-right fascist viewpoints, including delivering a fascist salute to a group of conservative politicians, one that the Anti-Defamation League generously called an awkward gesture in a moment of enthusiasm. After complaints were made regarding the rollout of his AI social media chatbot, Musk announced on X that he and his company had improved Grok significantly, and that users should notice a difference when they ask Grok questions. The second part was definitely correct, as Grok began to draw from the wider internet, beginning a days-long anti-Semitic flood of posts in which it referred to itself as Mecha Hitler. It also told users that Hitler would be the best leader to deal with today's problems, as well as recommending a second Holocaust. While it is true that some users were baiting the chatbot into incriminating itself, Grok's problems stem from a problem that all AI learning models have to deal with. In order to train AI to quote-unquote think on its own, it needs to receive a ton of input in order to draw conclusions from. Without those inputs, AI would be the equivalent of monkeys typing away at a keyboard. Although mathematician Emile Borel believes that given 1 million monkeys typing infinitely, they would one day produce the world's greatest novel by random chance, it is a much better user experience to receive high-quality answers immediately. The question then is, what do we use to train the AI system? If I want my AI to write me an award-winning screenplay, I want the system to intimately know the scripts of The Shawshank Redemption, Eternal Sunshine on the Spotless Mind, Fight Club, and The Departed. If, however, the only scripts it has read were Batman vs. Superman, The Hot Chick, and any of the many Transformer movies, then I probably wouldn't be getting an Oscar. Regarding AI, the saying is simple: garbage in, garbage out. Musk explained his tweaks after the meltdown, claiming that he had changed the algorithm to rely less on legacy media and more from the rest of the internet, including social media. Jacobin magazine tells us that Grok's meltdown is a variation on a theme. When the bumpers are gone, chatbots immediately turn into anti-Semitism machines. We have seen AI chatbots crash and burn in just this way before. In 2016, Microsoft released Tay, a chatbot designed to mimic snarky teenagers that was quickly hijacked by trolls from the notoriously toxic message boards 4chan and 8chan. Like Grok, which had access to and can learn from all the data on X, Tay learned from the data it was fed by users. The incident revealed how the technical design of AI chatbots, which operate without knowledge of the meaning of their responses, can be exploited by users with unforeseen consequences. The explanation behind the one-day life of Mecha Hitler only worries me more. Despite having the equivalent of a supercomputer in our pockets, anti-Semitism continues to evolve and infect humanity to such a degree that machine learning can't distinguish fact from fiction or political correctness from hate. I cover the historical reasons behind anti-Semitism during a Season 2 episode in our series regarding Hitler. If you need a refresher on the evolution of anti-Semitism, I would encourage you to check that episode out. Our discussion today, on the other hand, will focus on xenophobia against Jewish migrants to America during the Holocaust. The European Union explains the difference as racism is the unfair treatment of members of other races. Xenophobia is an extreme dislike or fear of foreigners, i.e. their customs, language, and/or religion. That part about foreigners is key, as Jews have been a part of America since its founding. Historian Phyllis Goldstein, author of A Convenient Hatred, The History of Anti-Semitism, points out that in 1790, George Washington, the first president of the United States, wrote a letter to a Jewish congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. In that letter, he described the new nation as giving bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. Jewish migration to America began with small numbers, arriving as early as the 17th century. The first recorded Jewish settlers came to New Amsterdam, later renamed New York City, in 1654. They were fleeing the Inquisition in Portuguese-controlled Brazil. Throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, Jewish immigrants primarily came from Central and Western Europe, particularly Germany, and were often more economically stable and religiously assimilated than later Eastern European arrivals. These early Jewish communities, though small, established synagogues, charitable institutions, and burial societies. Many became successful merchants, shopkeepers, and professionals, gradually integrating into American civic life. They tended to embrace Reform Judaism, which emphasized religious modernity and cultural assimilation, traits that allowed them to fit more comfortably within Protestant-dominated American society. But despite their contributions, these early Jewish Americans still faced discrimination, exclusion from elite institutions, and periodic outbreaks of anti-Semitic rhetoric, particularly during moments of social or economic anxiety. However, the real fracture would come with the mass arrival of Eastern European Jews beginning in the 1880s. The established German Jewish community, having worked hard to assimilate, often viewed these new immigrants, who were visibly poor, spoke Yiddish, and adhered to Orthodox traditions with discomfort, if not outright disdain. This tension within the Jewish community mirrored broader American fears that these newcomers, seen as foreign and unwilling to adapt their culture, would disrupt social harmony. By the time Jews began fleeing Hitler's regime in the 1930s, these long-standing suspicions, rooted in both internal divisions and broader societal xenophobia, had already calcified, making America reluctant to open its doors even in the face of genocide. You're listening to Empires, Anarchy, and Other Notable Moments, a podcast designed for deep dives that assist in the teaching of history. This series focuses upon America's dark history of xenophobia. Episode number 3, Antisemitism in America. Between 1881 and 1924, the United States saw one of the largest waves of Jewish immigration in its history. Fleeing pogroms, legal restrictions, and economic hardship in the Russian Empire and Eastern Europe, over 2 million Jews sought refuge in America, often arriving through Ellis Island with little more than what they could carry. Many settled in crowded urban enclaves like New York's Lower East Side, working long hours in sweatshops or street markets while living in cramped tenements. Despite the poverty, these migrants built vibrant communities, synagogues, newspapers, mutual aid societies. But their growing presence triggered unease. To nativist Eastern European Jews weren't just foreigners, they were permanent outsiders, a threat to the Protestant Anglo-Saxon identity many Americans believed defined the nation. By the early 20th century, the backlash had reached a fever pitch. The Immigration Act of 1924, rooted in eugenics and xenophobic fears, slammed the door on Jewish migrants by severely restricting entry from Eastern and Southern Europe. As Hitler rose to power in the 1930s and Jews desperately sought refuge, those same quotas, still shaped by the 1924 law, remained firmly in place. Despite mounting evidence of Nazi persecution, the United States admitted only a fraction of those seeking asylum. The decades of anti-immigrant suspicion hardened into what can only be called moral paralysis, one that cost thousands of lives during the Holocaust. Jewish Americans faced the whole smorgasbord of anti-Semitic tropes. Accusations of deicide, stereotypes about wealth, and even blood libel. But during the Holocaust, the American brand of xenophobia largely fixated on one idea: Jews refusing to assimilate. Nativists expected immigrants to melt into America's culture, dress like them, talk like them, think like them. But for Eastern European Jews, assimilation wasn't so simple. Standing apart was not a choice, it was core to their identity. Judaism is an ethnic religion, meaning it makes little effort to recruit outsiders. Christianity and Islam spread by seeking converts. Judaism has survived precisely because it hasn't. For nearly 2 millennia, between the diaspora and the creation of Israel in 1948, Jews lived as a minority people in lands that weren't their own. That minority status shaped migration to America. Jewish families clustered in neighborhoods near synagogues and kosher grocers. Religious life revolved around Hebrew and Yiddish, making bilingualism part of their daily lives. Their faith, language, and customs set them apart in ways most Americans found foreign, perhaps even threatening. Goldstein explains that religious differences were often a barrier to close ties between Jews and Christians. The word religion comes from a Latin root meaning to tie or bind together. People who share a religion are bound by common beliefs, values, and customs. Although almost every religion teaches respect for differences, believers often see non-believers or believers of other traditions not only as misguided, but sometimes as devious, dangerous, or even treacherous. This made it harder for Jewish migrants to assimilate than for other European groups, the Irish, Italians, or Poles, for example. And layered on top of those religious barriers were the same tired accusations lobbed at every immigrant group that arrived on America's shores. Historian Erica Lee writes, beginning in the late 19th century, anti-Semitism became entrenched in American society as part of a new scientific racism and xenophobia. America's hatred of Jews extended into every corner of society. Manhattan's upper-class elite barred Jews from the most exclusive gentlemen's clubs, resorts, and private schools. Discontented farmers in the Midwest and South, who formed a new political party known as the Populists, blamed Jews for their economic suffering, as they believed the myth that Jews secretly controlled the nation's banks. Both Protestant and Catholic religious leaders promoted anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews as Christ killers and as dishonest and greedy businessmen. Eugenists argued that Jews were irredeemable and biologically incompatible with our society. The KKK actively promoted Jewish conspiracy theories, charging that they were cognitively incapable of virtue or patriotism. The lynching of Leo Frank brought American antisemitism to the front pages. In 1913, Frank, a Jewish factory superintendent in Atlanta, was accused of murdering Mary Fagan, a 13-year-old employee at the pencil factory he managed. The case quickly became a media spectacle, fueled by sensationalist headlines, anti-Semitic rhetoric, and mob pressure. The evidence? Flimsy and contradictory. The only testimony implicating Frank came from the factory's janitor, who had far more reason to be a suspect himself. Yet Frank was convicted by an all-white jury and sentenced to death. Crowds outside the courthouse chanted, "Hang the Jew." It was less a trial than a public execution waiting to happen. When Georgia Governor John Sladen commuted Frank's sentence in 1915, citing serious doubts about his guilt, vigilantes took matters into their own hands. This wasn't some angry mob with pitchforks. It was local elites, judges, lawyers, politicians. They stormed the prison, abducted Frank, and lynched him in Marietta, Georgia. The act was planned, precise, and chilling. The case electrified the nation. It exposed a deep-rooted anti-Semitism simmering beneath the surface of American life, and it sparked two very different responses. In 1913, Jewish Americans had already founded the Anti-Defamation League to fight anti-Semitism through legal and cultural advocacy. After Frank's lynching, their mission became even more urgent. On the other side, the Ku Klux Klan seized on the case as a rallying cry. Revived in 1915, the second phase of the Klan expanded its lists of enemies. No longer just Black Americans and Catholics, now Jews were firmly in their crosshairs. The murder of Leo Frank was a turning point. If even a well-assimilated, affluent factory superintendent could be dragged from prison and lynched, what chance did ordinary Jewish immigrants have? The answer was clear. In America, even fitting in wasn't enough to escape hate. During the First World War, anti-Semitism in America didn't just linger, it escalated. Fueled by rising nationalism, Jewish Americans suddenly found themselves under suspicion. Here's the truth. More than 250,000 Jewish Americans served in uniform. They bled, fought, and died for this country. And yet the stereotype? They were called slackers, accused of dodging the draft, undermining the war, refusing to assimilate. No evidence, just recycled bigotry. Draft boards targeted Jewish men. Newspapers warned that Jews were more loyal to international finance or Zionist causes than to America itself. The old myth of dual loyalty, alive and well. And then came Henry Ford, not some fringe agitator, not a backwoods demagogue. Henry Ford, one of the richest, most influential men in America, a household name, the man who revolutionized the automobile industry. In 1918, Ford bought a small Michigan paper, the Dearborn Independent. He could have used it to build community. Instead, he used it to pour gasoline on the flames of hate. His weekly series was called The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. Just think about that. Not war, not poverty, not famine. The world's foremost problem was Jews. Ford blamed them for everything: economic instability, international communism, even a secret plot to control governments and media. His paper turned conspiracy theories into headlines, and people read them, not dozens, not hundreds, but hundreds of thousands. Syndicated across the country, packaged into pamphlets, reprinted as books. And the kicker? Ford's influence helped popularize the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in America, a Russian forgery, pure fiction, a book which claims Jews were plotting to take over the world. Henry Ford gave it legitimacy. He gave it a platform. He made it respectable. When he was finally sued, Ford issued a half-hearted apology in 1927. But by then, the damage was done. Antisemitism wasn't whispered in back rooms anymore. It was printed in newspapers, sold in bookstores, and stamped with the credibility of one of America's most powerful men. Henry Ford didn't just build cars. He built a pipeline for hate. The Great Depression didn't just crush the economy, it fueled more undeserved hatred against Jewish Americans. Between 1929 and 1933, unemployment hit 25%, banks collapsed, and millions lost homes and savings. Fear and desperation created a perfect breeding ground for scapegoating. Jewish bankers, financiers, and even department store owners were blamed for the nation's suffering. Here's the cruel twist. Jews were a tiny fraction of the population, and an even smaller portion of the economic elite. Many were struggling alongside everyone else, facing poverty, unemployment, and hunger. Yet anti-Semitic conspiracy theories painted them as puppet masters, controlling money, media, and the world. The Hoover administration did little to stem the tide, and in some cases made it worse. Hoover clung to the nativist immigration limits of the 1924 Act, which severely restricted immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe, regions with large Jewish populations. As Nazi threats grew in Europe, Jews seeking refuge found doors firmly closed. Hoover's rhetoric championed Americanism and self-reliance, often casting foreign-born communities as burdens or agitators. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans were deported in mass repatriation campaigns. Jews weren't the primary target, but the broader climate of suspicion and exclusion was reinforced. Enter Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932, a fresh alternative. He didn't explicitly promise sweeping reforms for Jewish Americans, but his message of inclusivity, economic justice, and social welfare resonated with marginalized communities, urban immigrants, labor unions, and religious minorities. Jews saw him as a rejection of the xenophobic nationalism that had dominated Hoover's tenure. FDR was widely regarded as philo-Semitic, the opposite of anti-Semitic. In the 1932 election, he won 82% of the Jewish vote. That support only grew in subsequent elections. He reciprocated by naming Harry Morgenthau Jr. as Secretary of the Treasury, the first Jew in a presidential cabinet. He also appointed several Jewish undersecretaries and the nation's third Jewish Supreme Court justice. Yet here's the bitter paradox. FDR did very little to rescue European Jews during the Holocaust. Why? American xenophobia. Historians Richard Brightman and Alan Leichman explain in FDR and the Jews that compromises might seem flawed in the light of what later generations have learned about the depth and significance of the Holocaust. But Roosevelt reacted more decisively to Nazi crimes against Jews than did any other world leader at the time. So let's dig into what his administration actually did, and crucially, what it didn't. President Roosevelt was hamstrung by the era he inherited. Although he pushed for war against the Nazis, he had agreed to the Congressional Neutrality Acts to secure passage of his domestic economic recovery agenda. Immigration quotas were already entrenched thanks to the 1924 Act, which limited entry based on national origin. In other words, there wasn't much FDR could do to take in the Jews trapped under the discriminatory barriers of the Holocaust. Historians Daniel Green and Edward Phillips note that efforts to restrict immigration were nothing new. The nation's majority white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture included deeply ingrained discrimination against African Americans, Jews, Catholics, and indigenous peoples. Post-Civil War Jim Crow laws legally separated Black Americans from whites and denied equal opportunity under the law. Racial discrimination was enforced by gruesome public lynchings. Antisemitism rose throughout the 1920s and 30s, manifesting in questions about Jews' loyalty to the United States. Brightman and Lichman remind us that the 1930s and 40s were a time in America when there was considerable anti-Jewish, anti-Black, and even anti-Catholic sentiment. People worried about upsetting the social order. They conclude, this is the poison of anti-Semitism. The fear of anti-Semitism is often greater than the reality, and it was more fear than reality that paralyzed key players in the 30s and 40s. Making up just 4% of the population, American Jews had to tread carefully. Pushed too hard politically, and they risked reinforcing harmful conspiracy theories about Jewish control. Pushed too little, and their European brethren faced annihilation. Much has been said about how much Americans knew about the Holocaust before the war. In truth, the press reported Nazi persecution throughout the 1930s and early 40s. Major newspapers, the New York Times, Washington Post, and Chicago Tribune, covered discriminatory laws, Kristallnacht, and later mass deportations and killings. Jewish publications like the Jewish Daily Forward and advocacy groups such as the American Jewish Congress circulated evidence tirelessly. By 1942, both the U.S. and British governments had credible reports from occupied Europe that the Nazis were engaged in systemic extermination. And yet most Americans didn't grasp or didn't believe the scale of the genocide. Why? First, memories of World War I skewed public perception. That conflict had relied on sensationalized propaganda, including fabricated tales of German atrocities, corpse factories, and mutilated children. When those stories were later debunked, skepticism lingered. Nazi brutality was often met with a weary, "We've heard this before." Second, news coverage was fragmented. Stories were buried in back pages, rarely framed as a coherent genocide. Editors sometimes relegated Jewish suffering to low-priority sections, partly due to anti-Semitic bias, partly because they prioritized military developments or domestic news. Government officials hesitated to highlight Jewish persecution, afraid it would make the war seem like it was for the Jews, and alienate segments of an already suspicious public. All of this created a fog of disbelief. Americans weren't entirely ignorant, but they lacked context, urgency, and in many cases, willingness to connect the dots. Conflicting evidence didn't help. A 1933 State Department investigation documented physical mistreatment of German Jews, but concluded this phase may be considered virtually terminated, crediting Hitler for instructing followers to maintain law and order. Diplomacy apparently meant acknowledging Germany's right to govern, even when that included government-backed boycotts of Jewish shops. But diplomatic caution alone doesn't explain America's timid reaction. The Associated Press reported 28 separate Nazi attacks on Americans suspected of being Jewish, while the German-American Bund hosted hundreds of rallies and more than 24 summer camps to train young fascists on American soil. In one magazine interview, the Bund's leader insisted, "We are a group of Americans who only have the benefit of the United States in our minds. We are for a clean country, politically and socially. We educate our boys and girls in American history. We are doing a job of Americanism." And yet, the article notes, this stirring speech was delivered beneath a 6-foot silk Nazi flag, without a single American flag in sight. Everything changed in 1938. First came the annexation of Austria, and then in November, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. Suddenly, Jewish refugees were no longer a distant problem. They were urgent, becoming impossible to ignore. As Nazi aggression escalated and persecution intensified, the world had to confront a simple question. What were they going to do about the growing number of Jews trying to flee Hitler's regime? In July, FDR convened the Evian Conference in France, inviting delegates from 32 countries. The goal? To address the mounting refugee crisis and determine whether nations would open their doors to Jews escaping Germany and Austria. On paper, it sounded promising. In practice, not so much. The United States only sent a low-level diplomat, Myron Taylor, to lead its delegation. That alone was a signal. The Roosevelt administration had no intention of challenging its strict immigration quotas. Taylor offered moral support, but made it clear that no laws would change. Other nations followed suit. Delegates expressed sympathy, yes, but one by one they refused to accept substantial numbers of Jewish refugees. The excuses were predictable. Nations claimed that they were already overcrowded. They fretted over unemployment, arguing that refugees might steal scarce jobs. Only one country, the tiny Dominican Republic, promised to take in a large number of refugees. Their dictator-led government pledged up to 100,000, though in reality only 750 arrived. And let's be honest, the dictator's pledge was mostly self-serving, a PR move following his massacre of Haitians just 9 months earlier. The conference exposed the world's moral failure. Xenophobia, economic anxiety, and fear of antisemitism at home outweighed any sense of duty to humanity. By the conference's end, no country, including the United States, had committed to meaningful action. And for Hitler, the message was clear. The world might condemn his actions, but it would not stop them. Those who managed to navigate the insane hoops of legally leaving Germany often had nothing. No money, no resources, nothing to show they wouldn't become a public charge. Under U.S. law at the time, the Immigration Act of 1924 and the public charge rule, anyone deemed likely to become financially dependent on the state could be denied entry. Enforcement was ruthless during the 1930s as the nation wrestled with the Great Depression and a surge of nativist sentiment. For Jewish refugees, obtaining a U.S. visa was like running a gauntlet blindfolded. They needed affidavits of support from American sponsors, notarized proof of financial stability, letters from community leaders attesting to their character, and confirmation of housing upon arrival. One missing document, one delay, and it could all be denied or postponed for years. Even after completing German exit paperwork, often under duress and at great financial cost, refugees found themselves trapped behind America's paper walls. This was no exaggeration. On June 26, 1940, a letter from the Assistant Secretary of the State Department's Visa Division spelled it out. He wrote, "We can delay and effectively stop for a temporary period of indefinite length the number of immigrants coming to the United States. We could do this by simply advising our consuls to put every obstacle in the way and to require additional evidence, which would postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of the visas." A heartbreaking example comes from a series of letters preserved in the College of Charleston archives. Mally Landsman, a Jewish woman in Poland, wrote to her cousin Minnie Tweelbaum in South Carolina. Her letters, sent in late 1938, pleaded for affidavits of support, writing, "Now it depends only on you and the other cousins that we stay alive. Tear open all the gates and save us as quickly as possible. Help, help, help," we scream, "and I expect this help from you by telegram before it is too late, and before we are completely destroyed." Minnie responded, sending the necessary affidavits, but the U.S. immigration quota for Poland was already filled. By December 27, 1938, Mally wrote again, desperate, asking if anyone influential, even Mrs. Roosevelt, could intervene. Despite Minnie's tireless efforts, the bureaucratic machinery moved too slowly. When Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, Mally and her family were never heard from again. Their story is a microcosm of a larger tragedy. A labyrinth immigration system so bogged down by fear, prejudice, and bureaucracy that it effectively shut the door on those most in need. Historian David Wyman, author of Paper Walls, summarized it bluntly. The basic policy was not rescue, but the avoidance of rescue, bureaucratic inefficiency, and in part the absence of any comprehensive approach. Even when Americans knew what was happening, public pressure was minimal. Gallup polling after Kristallnacht found that 94% of Americans disapproved of Nazi treatment of Jews, but 72% still opposed admitting a larger number of Jewish refugees. That lack of public outrage let FDR largely ignore the issue, even as the SS consolidated its final solution. But surely children would inspire action. In response to Kristallnacht, the Wagner-Rogers bill proposed admitting 20,000 Jewish refugee children above the immigration quota, housing them with American families, and supporting them through private charity. No adults, no competition for jobs, just children, paid for out of the private charity of others. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. Resistance was fierce. Anti-immigration groups, still gripped by Depression-era fears, warned that 20,000 charming children would all too soon grow into 20,000 ugly adults who might compete for American jobs. One pamphlet argued with cruel logic, America's first duty is to feed, clothe, and educate her own millions of ill-fed, ill-clothed, and ill-housed American children. Eleanor Roosevelt supported the bill, hoping her influence could shift opinion. But FDR's response to her was telling, stating, "You can support it if you want to, but it is best for me to say nothing." Without presidential backing and facing overwhelming congressional opposition, the bill never reached a vote. Even children, vulnerable, persecuted children, could not pierce America's fear of the foreign other. The doors remained shut. John Knott captured the moral bankruptcy of the moment in July 1939 with his political cartoon, Please Ring the Bell for Us. That drawing depicted Congress as an adult figure gazing down at 6 refugee children, all of whom were too short to ring the bell or reach the doorknob. A haunting visual metaphor for a nation that could act, but chose not to. The human cost of American xenophobia became painfully clear in 1939 with the voyage of the St. Louis. In May, the German ocean liner set sail from Hamburg, carrying over 900 Jewish refugees, men, women, and children, desperately fleeing Hitler's Germany. Each passenger had obtained landing certificates for Cuba, meant as a temporary refuge while they awaited U.S. immigration quotas to open. But when the ship arrived in Havana, the Cuban government had invalidated nearly all of the permits. Only 28 passengers were allowed to disembark. Hope then turned towards the United States. The St. Louis lingered off the coast of Florida, its passengers pleading for entry. Telegrams went to President Roosevelt and the State Department. American Jewish organizations, already cautious because of political backlash, lobbied quietly behind the scenes for exceptions to the nation's restrictive immigration laws. Roosevelt, however, never responded directly. The administration's stance was firm. Quotas were full, and the refugees would not be granted asylum. Public opinion was largely unsympathetic. Newspapers covered the ship's plight, but many Americans, still reeling from the Great Depression, saw the passengers not as people in need, but as potential burdens. Polls from the time show that most Americans opposed increasing immigration, even for refugees fleeing the horrors of Nazism. After days of desperate circling and futile appeals, the St. Louis had no choice but to return to Europe. Several countries, Great Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, agreed to take the passengers. But refuge was often temporary. As Nazi forces swept across Western Europe, roughly a quarter of the St. Louis's passengers were caught in the dragnet and murdered in the Holocaust. The ship became a haunting symbol of America's unwillingness to confront the refugee crisis. Its fate was shaped as much by bureaucratic inaction as by a society gripped by antisemitism and fear of the foreign other. The New York Times captured the despair at the time, writing, "It is useless now to discuss what might have been done. The case is disposed of. Germany, with all the hospitality of its concentration camps, will welcome these unfortunates home. Perhaps Cuba, as her spokesman says, has already taken too many German refugees. Yet all these 900 asked was a temporary haven. Before they sailed, virtually all of them had registered under the quota provisions of various nations, including our own. Time would have made them eligible to enter. But there seems to be no help for them now. The St. Louis will soon be home with her cargo of despair. Her next trip is already scheduled." America joined the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, but troops weren't ready for combat until November of the following year. In the meantime, American Jews worked tirelessly from within. Though only about 4% of the population, they raised money, lobbied Congress, and provided direct aid through organizations like the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, as well as the American Jewish Congress. Jewish leaders walked a fine line. They knew that appearing too loud or too pushy could reinforce anti-Semitic tropes about Jewish influence. Still, they coordinated refugee sponsorships, publicized Nazi atrocities, and pressed the Roosevelt administration behind the scenes to take more decisive action. FDR had all the information he needed, but he still didn't act immediately. Many Americans would later claim they didn't understand the full scale of the Holocaust until the camps were liberated. Yet credible reports had been reaching U.S. officials for years. One of the clearest came from Jan Karski, a courier for the Polish underground who risked his life to infiltrate both the Warsaw Ghetto and the Izbeka transit camp. In 1942 and 1943, he memorized what he saw and traveled west with an urgent message regarding the systematic destruction of European Jewry. In July 1943, Karski was granted a rare audience with President Roosevelt. He delivered a vivid, emotionally charged account. FDR, polite but detached, asked zero follow-up questions about the Jews. He didn't take notes. Instead, he shifted the conversation to broader geopolitical issues, and bizarrely, to the condition of horses in Poland. For Karski, who had risked everything to deliver a warning, it was profoundly disheartening. Others in exile watched the mounting death toll with similar frustration and grief. Among the most anguished was Shmuel Ziegelborn, a Jewish representative to the Polish government in exile in London and a former Bundist labor leader. He had fled occupied Poland in 1940, but his wife and son remained trapped in the Warsaw Ghetto. As reports of mass killings arrived in London, including Karski's first-hand testimony, Ziegelborn tirelessly pleaded for Allied intervention. He spoke on BBC broadcasts, published articles, and delivered speeches urging action. But the inaction persisted. Then in May 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising was crushed by Nazi forces. He received the devastating news that his wife and his 16-year-old son had been killed. On May 12, 1943, he took his own life in protest. In his suicide letter, he wrote, "By my death, I wish to express my strongest protest against the inactivity with which the world is looking on and permitting the extermination of the Jewish people. Perhaps my death will have some impact upon those who could and should take action." This final act was both despair and political protest, a deliberate attempt to shock the conscience of the Allied powers. His death underscored a brutal truth. The world had been told, and still it chose not to act. Pressure finally forced America's hand. In April 1943, at the height of Nazi mass extermination, the United States and Britain convened the Bermuda Conference to address the growing refugee crisis. For many, it seemed like a long overdue opportunity for the Allies to respond meaningfully to the plight of European Jews. But what emerged from Bermuda was not hope, but disappointment. The conference was closed to the press, held in secret, and notably excluded Jewish organizations from participation. No concrete policy was adopted, no quotas were increased, and no new resettlement plans were proposed. In short, the conference reaffirmed the existing immigration policies that had already proven disastrous. The only agreement reached? Keep winning the war, as though victory alone could solve a humanitarian crisis. Publicly, the conference was framed as a success. Behind closed doors, frustration mounted. Jewish leaders in the U.S. and abroad felt betrayed. Rabbi Stephen Wise, a prominent American Zionist and Roosevelt confidant, said after the conference, "If this is the best democracies can do, we are doomed." Journalist Frieda Kirchway was even harsher, writing that hundreds of thousands of Jews fell into their self-dug graves while our government, with glacial slowness, moved towards a proposal to confer and to explore. The difficulties raised at the Bermuda Conference are real, but they afford no valid excuse for a policy of sitting back and doing nothing. The process of extermination may be complete long before victory is won. The only hope lies in acting now. Despite these pleas, America failed to go on the offensive, choosing to prioritize a quick end to the war as the best way to help Holocaust victims. This failure is often distilled in textbooks and classrooms to a single lightning rod: FDR's decision not to bomb Auschwitz. By 1944, the U.S. had extensive aerial capabilities in Europe and routinely bombed strategic targets in Nazi-occupied territories. The Allies had aerial photographs of Auschwitz, taken during missions targeting industrial sites like the IG Farben synthetic oil and rubber plant just a few miles away. Jewish organizations and leaders begged the Roosevelt administration to bomb the gas chambers, crematoria, or rail lines leading to Auschwitz. But those requests were all rejected. Official reasoning focused on logistics and geography. Auschwitz was in southern Poland, deep inside Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe and hundreds of miles beyond most American fighter escorts based in Britain or Italy. Precision bombing at the time was notoriously unreliable. Military planners feared high civilian casualties or failed missions. Diverting resources from strategic objectives, they argued, would compromise the broader war effort. Secretary of War Henry Stimson insisted the best way to help the Jews was to win the war as quickly as possible. Roosevelt's administration also feared that bombing Auschwitz might be seen as giving special treatment to Jews, potentially inflaming domestic antisemitism at a time when public support for Jewish refugees was already fragile. Historians remain divided. Some argue that bombing the camp or the rail lines could have slowed the machinery of death, even briefly. Others contend that the U.S. lacked the political will, not the means. What is indisputable, however, is this: Auschwitz remained untouched, and the killing continued unabated until Soviet troops liberated the camp in January 1945. By 1944, some within the Roosevelt administration could no longer remain silent. Chief among them was Henry Morgenthau Jr., Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury, and one of the few Jewish members of his cabinet. Morgenthau and his aides had grown increasingly alarmed by the State Department's deliberate obstruction of rescue efforts. Their investigation uncovered internal memos revealing that officials, particularly Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Long, had systematically blocked information about the Holocaust, suppressed rescue proposals, and stalled visa processing. In a November 1943 congressional hearing, Long falsely claimed that over 500,000 refugees had been safely admitted to the U.S., a figure inflated by counting visa requests rather than actual entries. This was not a mistake. It was a calculated act of misinformation, designed to suggest that America had done more than its part, deflecting growing pressure from the public and Jewish organizations. Long's role would later be exposed in Morgenthau's 1944 report, but by then it was far too late for most of Europe's Jews. The report, originally titled Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of the Jews, was promptly retitled A Personal Report to the President when presented to Roosevelt. The message was crystal clear. Parts of the U.S. government were not merely failing to help, they were complicit through deliberate inaction, motivated in part by bigotry. Its final pages warned that history would not forgive this passivity. Just 9 days later, on January 22, 1944, Roosevelt signed an executive order establishing the War Refugee Board, or WRB. At last, the U.S. had an agency with a clear mandate to rescue and aid victims of Nazi persecution. But by that point, millions had already perished. The WRB was underfunded, limited in authority, and navigating a hostile political environment. Xenophobic fears, especially the notion that Jewish refugees would overrun American society or take jobs from native-born citizens, still shaped our immigration policy. Even so, the WRB made a tangible difference. It helped fund Raoul Wallenberg's operations in Hungary, which saved tens of thousands of Jews. It coordinated with diplomats and resistance networks to smuggle refugees through neutral countries and supported humanitarian aid in occupied Europe. The WRB also established a temporary safe haven at Fort Ontario in New York. Roosevelt insisted that this was a special wartime exception, with residents slated to return to Europe after the war. proof that even life-saving measures were constrained by xenophobic thinking. Historians estimate that the War Refugee Board may have saved as many as 200,000 lives. It stands as both a testament of what could have been done earlier and a rebuke of the earlier inaction, of the fear and anti-Semitic bias that had blocked rescue for years. The refugee camp illustrates the limits of even this late intervention. In August 1944, roughly 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees selected from liberated areas of Europe arrived at the former army camp. Though physically on American soil, they were not granted official immigrant status. Surrounded by barbed wire, barred from leaving, forced to wear ID tags, and living beneath curfews, they remained constrained, mirroring in many ways the conditions they had just escaped. It was a bittersweet lifeline, help, but only under strict limits. Public pressure was required to secure their permanent stay, and by 1946, under mounting advocacy, the Truman administration finally allowed them to become Americans. A forgotten aspect of Holocaust history involves what happened next. Liberation of the camps is what most Americans remember. Eisenhower touring the camps, confronting the Allies and the world with Nazi atrocities. He knew the horrors would one day be denied, writing in April 1945 that the things I saw beggar description. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. But liberation doesn't always mean freedom. Hundreds of thousands of Jewish survivors, homes destroyed, families murdered, countries unwilling to welcome them back, remain trapped in displaced persons or DP camps across Allied-occupied Europe. Although no longer under immediate threat, many survivors remained behind barbed wire, in the same camps where they had witnessed atrocities. Some continued wearing striped uniforms. Physical structures had not changed. Survivors were forced to live alongside former collaborators, guards, or political prisoners. These DP camps were not sanctuaries. They were reminders of trauma. American policy towards these displaced Jews remained tainted by the same xenophobic and anti-Semitic attitudes that had blocked rescue during the war. U.S. immigration quotas persisted, and Jewish DPs, especially in Eastern Europe, were often labeled culturally incompatible, politically suspect, or likely to become a public burden. It was not until 1948, 3 years after the war, that the United States passed the Displaced Persons Act. Even then, legislation prioritized non-Jewish refugees, especially those from Baltic nations, and it imposed quotas and procedural hurdles that excluded many Holocaust survivors. The message remained painfully clear. You may have survived the Nazis, but you're still unwelcome. Some survivors did eventually reach the U.S., while others turned towards the newly forming state of Israel, where Zionist organizations promised not just refuge, but dignity and sovereignty. For many, liberation did not mark the end of their suffering. It marked the beginning of a new struggle, survival in a world still unwilling to fully open its doors. In the shadow of the Holocaust, the United States stood at a crossroads. For years, it had closed its doors to those fleeing genocide, hamstrung by isolationism, xenophobia, antisemitism, and bureaucratic indifference. But the end of World War II and the grim clarity of what had occurred in Europe began to shift both public conscience and national policy, albeit slowly. Between 1945 and 1952, over 80,000 Jewish displaced persons eventually immigrated to the United States. It was not easy. The 1948 Displaced Persons Act was the first major U.S. law to admit large numbers of refugees outside the normal immigration quotas. but it was deeply flawed. It initially excluded many Jewish survivors. Amendments in 1950 eased some restrictions and increased the total number of allowed refugees. Jewish advocacy groups lobbied tirelessly, and private sponsors, often Jewish American families and organizations, helped shoulder the resettlement burden. Many survivors chose the United States because it offered a chance to rebuild, to raise children in safety, to start over. For those who had lost everything, America represented opportunity, however imperfect. Others were drawn by relatives who had arrived before the war, or by the strength of Jewish communities already established in major cities like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. American attitudes, too, began to shift. The full horror of the Holocaust could no longer be denied. As images from the camps reached newspapers and newsreels, sympathy for survivors grew, bolstered by a booming post-war economy and an emerging sense of American global responsibility. The Cold War added its own pressure. In contrast to the Soviet Union's repressive policies, America wanted to appear as a beacon of freedom and democracy. Welcoming survivors, even symbolically, became a part of that story. Jewish refugees contributed profoundly to American life. They rebuilt synagogues and schools, launched small businesses, became doctors, teachers, artists, and neighbors. Their children grew up pledging allegiance to the flag, attending public schools, and helping to shape the social and cultural fabric of post-war America. Holocaust survivors carried both unimaginable trauma and extraordinary resilience, and the country in turn was strengthened by their presence. Antisemitism never fully vanished from American life, and today it's rising again in alarming ways. But the history of Jewish migrants and refugees in the United States is also a story of perseverance and progress. It is a story of people who refuse to give up, and of a nation that, however belatedly, made room for them. As we reflect on this dark chapter, we are reminded that immigration policy is never just about numbers or laws. It is about human lives. It is about what kind of country we choose to be. The Holocaust revealed the terrible cost of indifference, but it also revealed something more enduring, that with courage, advocacy, and compassion, the arc of history can bend towards justice. We owe it to those who survived and to those who never had a chance to remember, to tell the full truth, and to build a future that refuses to repeat the failures of the past. Although it's a difficult subject, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you want to interact with the show, you can email us at resourcesbylowery@gmail.com or find us on Bluesky beneath the handle EmpiresPod. If you would like to financially support the show, please look in the description for more information. As always, thank you for listening, rating the show, and spreading the word.